Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us today in the final lecture of this series on Tibetan art and Himalayan art. It gives me great pleasure to welcome you all this evening to the final talk in the series of the series of Tibetan art lectures from the Land of Snows, the Art and Material Culture of Tibet and the Himalayas. Thank you both to the Research Forum and the Trans-Asia's Research Cluster for hosting this series. And thank you also to all of you who've made the effort to attend and to come and to interact with this series over the last academic year. It's been really a wonderful experience. And thank you also for making it such a fantastic success. I'm really thrilled to introduce our speaker, Dr. Monisha Ahmed, for her lecture, Textiles from the Ladakh Himalayas. Dr. Ahmed is the founder and director of Ladakh Arts and Media Organization in Leh. She is an independent researcher, writer, and curator whose work focuses on art practices and material culture in Ladakh. Her doctoral degree in social anthropology from Oxford University was on the textiles of nomadic pastoralists from Changtang and developed into the book Living Fabric, Weaving Among the Nomads of the Ladakh Himalaya. It received the Textile Society of America's R.L. Shep Award in 2003 and for the best book in the field of ethnic textile studies. She's also co-edited Ladakh Culture at a Crossroads, published in 2005, and collaborated on Pashmina, the Kashmir Shawl and Beyond, published in 2009 and 2017, and published several articles on the textiles of the Himalayan world. From 2010 to 16, she was also the associate editor of Marg magazine. So we're both here together, so thank you very much.
Thank you, Jordan. Hi, thank you, Jordan, for inviting me to give this talk. And I'm very sorry that we had to cancel a few weeks ago. And thank you to the court holder and to Grace for helping with all the technical organization. So welcome to Textiles from the Ladakh Himalaya. I think what I'm going to do in this talk this evening is sort of take you through several centuries of Ladakhi textiles, beginning with, the early images, also telling you about transformations and change in the tradition. And for me, in many ways, this image kind of epitomizes that. It sort of represents, changes where people, there's one gentleman wearing a maroon robe that's made from wool. There are the two people in the center are wearing polyester robes, but still following the Ladakhi design. The other woman is wearing a turquoise-studded headdress, the perak, but she's wearing a silk brocade robe. Yeah, so I think, looking at footwear, looking at headgear, looking at some of these transformations that have taken place, but also looking at all the stories that textiles tell us about the origin of life, about religion, about community and kinship. And these are some of the things that I would like to touch on this evening. I'm sure many of you are familiar with Ladakh or maybe have been there. I don't have to tell you too much about it in terms of locations. It is located in this in sort of middle of the Himalayan and Karakoram mountain range. It was a place that Janet Rizvi very famously coined in the sort of title to a book called Crossroads of High Asia, because Ladakh was a place where people came in from Central Asia, from Tibet, from China, from the lower plains of India. They came across from Iran and Afghanistan, and it was very much a place like a melting pot for traders. And actually, we are looking down at the town of Leh, the patch that you see sort of off center. That's Leh. You have the Stok Kangri mountain range at the back. And in front, this is the trade route that would have come down from Central Asia, from Xinjiang. And so trade was very important to Ladakh. When we look at textiles in the region, we're looking at basically two kinds of textiles. One that was made there from locally available resources of wool and pashmina, largely those that came from nomadic communities in the northeast from Changtang, and then textiles that came in through trade, silk, carpets, cotton. These were some of the textiles that sort of came in through trade. And together, this is what sort of makes the textile traditions of Ladakh, which I'll talk about as we go on. The town of Leh itself was very important for trade. And if you look at the upper sort of the archival image, you see Leh Palace in the center. So Sengi Namgyal, one of the most powerful kings of Ladakh in the early 17th century, moved the capital of Leh from Sheh to Leh because he realized that Leh was very advantageous in terms of trade. And so the royal family also controlled a vast amount of this trade that came through Ladakh. The other thing that the royal family also did is that they also dictated fashion. They dictated who could wear what. They dictated who could use color. They dictated, they sort of also set the trends. And it was very much, for instance, if you were royalty, if you were from the ministry, if you were from a family that belonged to a minister, or you were clergy, that you could use imported cloth. That you could wear dyed cloth. Most people, commoners in villages, they had to wear the natural colors that came off, sort of the sheep mainly, because that's what they used. They wore sheep wool. So men wore white robes and women wore black and brown robes. If they wanted to use and if they could afford a little bit of the imported fabric, then they would, maybe just stitch a little bit on the collar or on the cuffs of their sleeves or the slits of their dresses. So this was, the kind of the dictates for clothing kind of came from this palace. So Ladakh till about the 10th century was sort of ruled by sort of smaller chieftains. It was only in the 10th century that the Namgyal dynasty, which was part of the Tibetan Yarlung lineage, sort of established itself in Ladakh. And the Namgyal dynasty has sort of almost continued here since then. Also, when we look at the history of Ladakh, and many people ask, why was Ladakh part of this sort of the state of Jammu and Kashmir? How did it become part of the Dogra Empire? So really, it was because of textiles. Maharaja Gulab Singh, who we see sitting over here wearing a lovely, probably a green pashmina shawl with some embroidery on the edges, and his general Zorawar Singh were very interested in the trade in pashmina. They wanted a stake in the trade in pashmina, or Kashmir as you call it, because it was very lucrative. But this trade was very tightly controlled by the Tibetans, the Ladakhis, and the Kashmiris, and you couldn't actually break into this trade. It was punishable by death. And so in the early 1830s, Maharaja Gulab Singh sent his general Zorawar Singh to conquer Ladakh and then to conquer Western Tibet. Unfortunately, it was winter by the time Zorawar Singh reached the border between Ladakh and Tibet, and he died. And since the sort of 1834, Ladakh has been part of the Dogra Empire. After independence with India, it became part of the state of Jammu and Kashmir. And in 2019, when the state of Jammu and Kashmir was bifurcated, Ladakh is now a union territory. So it's interesting that in many ways it was textiles that also shaped Ladakh's political and in some ways cultural history. We have two main religious groups in Ladakh, the Buddhists and Muslims. Buddhism has been around in Ladakh since maybe around the sort of 7th century, and Islam came in much later in the 14th century. But we also see how these two religious groups have shaped in many ways the textile traditions in Ladakh, how they occupy spaces, sacred spaces that are demarcated by, for instance, the prayer flag that you see in the two images. People tie prayer flags on bridges, on high mountain passes, to protect them, to give them blessings. But it's also the wind horse that is printed in the middle of the flag that is said to carry these prayers around the valley. And basically, like, you have, the sort of continuous sort of sacred space that you have all around you. In Islam, we find that we don't have prayer flags with any, sort of printed with any symbols or anything on it, but we do find people tie flags outside the mosque. Sometimes when they've asked for a wish and it's been granted, they will go back and make an offering, usually of fabric. So that we do see similarities. Even the khatak, which is the ceremonial scarf, a white ceremonial scarf that people offer to Rinpoches, to High Lamas, or even at the time of birth, marriage. You'll find it in Buddhism, and you'll also find it in Islam. It's only that in Buddhism, they print sort of Buddhist prayers onto the scarf, or they print the 8 lucky auspicious Buddhist signs, whilst in Islam, you'll find that it's just a plain white scarf. The third community, that religious community that is there in Ladakh, is very small in number, but has had a very big impact on the textile traditions of this region, and that is the Moravian missionaries, who came to Ladakh towards the end of the 19th century. And they were very influential here, and they have made a huge impact, and I will be talking about that sort of later in my presentation. So weaving practices in Ladakh can largely be divided between the agricultural and pastoral societies. In sort of the central, southern, and western regions of Ladakh, you find agriculture practiced. And in the north and in the west, we find nomadic pastoralists who herd yaks, sheep, goats. But throughout Ladakh, the loom is commonly referred to as thaksha, and the weaver is a thakskan. But what we find in the central and western regions of Ladakh, where you have the agricultural settled populations that live, weaving is exclusively men's work, and it's done using foot loom. The craft is generally practiced, sort of passed down from father to son, but it doesn't have to be hereditary. It's not a full-time occupation. It's usually, people who maybe are doing agricultural work in the summer, and in the winter, they'll set up their loom and they will weave spun yarn that's brought to them by various women in the village. They might also take their loom, because their looms are portable, and move from village to village, weaving for various households. What's interesting that in amongst agricultural populations, women are prohibited from weaving. They say that if a woman were to weave, her hands would burst into flames, or the mountains would collapse. They say that if a woman should touch a man's loom, there will be terrible fights between them. It could lead to her being infertile. So basically, there was almost like a taboo or a ban on women weaving amongst the agricultural populations. But, and similarly, there was also this prohibition on women stitching. Women were not allowed to cut, they were not allowed to stitch. But they were spinning, they were carding, they were cleaning, they were washing the wool. So they were doing all the preparatory stages until we came to actual practice of weaving. And most of the fabric they made was called nambu, which is a woolen fabric woven in either a tabby or a twill weave, and is largely used for all the sort of fabric that's made into the ropes that people wear, the uppers of boots, the belts. So it's the main fabric that's worn in the region. When we come to the nomadic populations of Ladakh, we find that both men and women weave here. And it's not very common to find societies where both men and women weave, and they weave on different looms. So men weave on a fixed heddle loom, and women weave on a backstrap loom. Women also only weave with wool from the sheep and the yak. And men will only weave from hair from the goat and the yak. So they each have very fixed sort of a repertoire of what they weave. Women weave, in contrast to the men who make the woolen fabric amongst in agricultural societies. Here, the women weave the woolen fabric used in all clothes. They also weave coverings for the floor, blankets, a variety of saddlebags to hold their possessions. Women are also allowed to work with colored yarn. They are allowed to dye the yarn and weave with that. In contrast, men only make tents. They make a variety of saddlebags that are carried by sheep and goats, horses and yaks. They make a rough blanket called a challi, which they use when they're trading, and they stitch and they cut all fabric, but they only work with yarn in natural colors. So these are the kind of two contrasts we have between men and women weaving. Men also do applique and patchwork. They also make boots. They make hats. They used to make a lot of felt in this region, but now a lot of they've stopped doing that more or less, and now they work with a lot more synthetic felt. When it comes to the origins of weaving in Ladakh, or the first textiles that were actually made and worn there, there are some oral references, there are some early visuals to look at, but archaeological excavations haven't really yielded that much. But in their sort of narratives, they kind of say that weaving is crucial to life in Ladakh, and they say that the relationships that exist within a family, they have a proverb, and they say, "We are all warp and weft." And in many ways, you can actually, through the textiles that are made, you can actually connect people to each other. There are mandatory gifts that are made at a time of a wedding from, let's say, the bride's uncle or the bride's aunt. There are things that when you walk into a home, you can connect to various people. So it's very interesting the way you can use textiles in a wider sense to connect different families and communities across homes or across tents to each other. They also have a saying where they say that textiles in Ladakh represent life, the very essence of life, because they say in the male loom, both in the foot loom and the fixed heddle loom, the weaving process and the finished fabric signify the birth of a child. So the warp, which is strong and tightly twisted, represents the man. The weft, which is weak and loose in comparison, is the woman. But as you weave the fabric, and when the finished fabric is finished and taken off the loom, it represents the birth of a child. It's a similar end product in a female loom, only here they say that the warp is the mother, and the weft she inserts to make her cloth is the child conceived within her womb. So as the cloth is made, so the child inside her grows, and the finished fabric represents the birth of a child. So it's also very inauspicious when somebody is weaving to step over the warp, because they say if you step over the warp, then the child will be born with some kind of deformities or something. So you must never step over the warp when a woman has her warp open and stretched on the ground. There's another proverb that they have. They say that the warp is like a person and the weft is like barley flour. And as you feed, a person more and more barley flour, so and as you sort of weave the weft into the warp, then you have a person, and then you have a person who can live and work. So there are all these analogies, sort of proverbs that they have connecting weaving to life. They also say that weaving and the loom are modeled on the mythical loom of Duguma. Now, Duguma is King Kesar's wife, and many of you might be familiar with King Kesar. He's sort of a mythical hero god in the world of Mongolia, Tibet, Ladakh, and other parts of the Western Himalaya. And it is said that his wife sits somewhere and that she weaves one row a year, and that when she completes her fabric, the world will come to an end. They say that when this happens, everything will go upside down and there will be nothing left on this earth. But that's really what they say for women's weaving. And they see Duguma as the archetype for all present-day weavers. But for men who weave on the footloom, they say that they think the footloom originated from Kashmir because there is another oral tradition from Kargil that talks about the town being founded by two men, and they say one was a weaver. And they have a whole area in Kargil that's named after this weaver. Though now I think nobody weaves in Kargil anymore. It's been almost 20 years now since weaving practically has come to an end there. We have another story also that is narrated by the nomadic pastoralists who live in Changthang. And they say this, they say in the beginning, the world was populated by gigantic demons, and they were very strong and powerful, and they destroyed everything in sight and even ate their own children. Then one day a big lama, probably Padmasambhava, because Padmasambhava in Tibetan Buddhism is sort of associated with many demon-quelling rituals. So they say Padmasambhava came and told these demons that they must stop their bad ways and live peacefully with all living creatures. And then the Lama taught religion to them. So they say the men were wiser, listened to the Lama, and became men, but the female demons did not. They still went around creating havoc. And so he taught them to weave. And then they became women. But in order to stop them from becoming demons again and going back to their wicked ways, they had to keep weaving. And that's why even today, women are kept busy weaving the whole day. And so they do not stray back to their wicked ways. It's very interesting because they say that, good weavers make good wives. They sort of connect weaving to morality. Like if you are busy weaving sitting at your loom and weaving the whole day, then you don't have time to stray or you don't commit sinful actions. So it's very interesting then how weavers are also good weavers are perceived within a community. If they weave neatly and they pay attention to detail, they say they will become good wives. And so weaving is taught to girls from a very young age, maybe 14, 15, amongst the nomadic communities, so that they start learning this craft and that it is, becomes a part of her growth process. Whilst men learn much later, it's not as important, as imperative that they learn how to weave. They also have something called the Song of the Loom, which is probably a bit to draw women into the sphere of religious activities, which their ancestors, the demons, rejected. And they recognize religious beliefs and reinforce them through women's weaving. So, for instance, in the song, they tell women to conceive of the loom as precious as the main shrine room in a monastery. The square mat they sit on whilst weaving is seen as a meditation cushion. The two sections of the front roller are conceived as the wooden covers that hold the prayer books in a monastery. The back strap, which holds the loom around their back, is conceived as the casting of samsara, and the sound of the beater is said to be the voice of Buddha reciting prayers. The balls of weft passing from right to left are the kettle that serves tea up and down the monastery hall. The raising of the heddle is said to be similar to ascending in this world after death, and the lowering of the heddle as pushing all sin down with your as pushing all sin down with your feet. And finally, the warp stretched out in front is seen as the path to liberation. So the whole process of weaving for women then becomes a continuous reminder of the fundamental spiritual concepts and demonstrates the craft's engagement with religion and the place of women within this network. So apart from oral narratives, there is little textual or archaeological evidence to reconstruct the early history of textiles in Ladakh, and even more difficult to reconstruct textiles and dress in this region. We have clay spindle holes. We have needles that have been found at Neolithic sites on the Tibetan Plateau. And the Tibetan Plateau is what also extends into the Changthang parts of Ladakh. And this probably suggests that weaving of some sort, or basically fabric making of some sort, existed during this time. We have petroglyphs that date to the Bronze Age, but it's very difficult to discern dress in them. I mean, we see some with human forms, but they're more like stick figures rather than any, that are dressed or clothed. But the Ladakhis do talk about a time when they used skin. So they would wear skin like capes over their shoulders, or like the gentleman here who's giving himself a robe made from skin. So skin was widely used everywhere in Ladakh. And it's only now that the clergy and the lamas have been telling them that you shouldn't use skin. It's sinful to use skin. And so they have been switching over to either using imitation skins, or they are gradually stopping the use of skin. In the western part of Ladakh, we have a group of people who are called the Brokpas, and there are stories that they are descendants of Alexander the Great, and his soldiers, when they were retreating, some of them moved westwards and didn't go back with him, and they settled here. But these are largely stories that have been told over the years. But the Brokpas are largely from Gilgit. They've been migrating down. They were said to once inhabit the whole of Ladakh. They were animistic. They spoke a language called Shina. But today, most of them have either converted to Islam or they're Buddhist. A lot of their practices have changed. They have also gradually assimilated themselves into wearing Ladakhi dress. Otherwise, their own dress was quite different and unique. But it has transformed itself so much over the years, especially over the last 20 years, because of the tourism that has come into this area. A lot of people go to see the Brokpas, and they've become something of exotic, to use a want of a better word. And so it's very difficult now to tell, what their dress might have looked like. There's very little photographic, even sort of visual imagery. Their headdresses have become very elaborate, with sort of plastic, what they used to use real flowers. Now it's plastic flowers and things. So, and they've been very, very, very little sort of studied and as a group. So I think if somebody were to go into this area and look at their textiles, it might sort of open up a lot of interesting stories, because the Brokpas were the original inhabitants in Ladakh. We also know that, as Buddhism entered Ladakh, not from Tibet, but it came from India, and it started coming in via the Kushan dynasty. And this is a sort of a metal cup that was found in Kargil, and it has various sort of scenes around the cup. And, it does show people in dress. Whether it was dress at that time, we don't know, or whether it was actually something that came in from outside. But just by studying the different imagery on this, you get some kind of an indication of something that might have been there, but we are not sure. I think rock carvings and and as we gradually come to paintings, but rock carvings at Dras were probably the first indication of kind of dress worn in Ladakh. These rock carvings are not in very good condition, but they were seen by Snellgrove and Skorupski when they visited in the 70s. And they say that on the back of the Avalokiteshvara statue that you see standing here, there is a horseman, and he's wearing a long-sleeved short jacket over pants and boots, and he's holding a sword in his right hand. But they also say that this is probably not the outfit of a Ladakhi. It probably could be maybe a Central Asian soldier, and but this gives some kind of indication. I mean, we know that trousers sort of were gradually was a garment that was an essential attire for nomads, especially because they were constantly on horses. They also wore sort of loose upper garments so that allowed mobility. So this is maybe one of the first representations that we do have of dress that could have been from Central Asia, but also as part of the sort of wider Ladakhi communities. We then come to the Buddha at Mulbek. It's some people say this is Maitreya, but more and more now people say no, it's Avalokiteshvara. And if we look towards his feet, we see that on the right-hand side there are female devotees, but they are mainly wearing saris. And it could not have survived in the cold in Ladakh wearing a sort of a half garment like a sari. But on the left, we see male devotees, and one of them is wearing a robe, very similar to what is worn in Ladakh today, with a sash around his waist and a hat that could be, what we call the tibi in Ladakh. Though some Ladakhis say that no, the tibi came with the dogras. It did not come. It was not there in existence before. And so this is another visual representation that we have. Then we come to Alchi, and this is something that Jordan has studied very extensively. But if we do look at Alchi, the monastic complex, and we look at, in particular, the Sumstek, the three-storied temple right in the middle of the complex, we see the most amazing wall paintings on the ceilings that tell us a lot about the textile traditions in this area. I mean, they look not only at textiles that were made in Ladakh at this time, but also textiles that probably came in through trade or maybe through pilgrimage. Alchi was constructed by Rinchen Zangpo. He was a great scholar that went from Tibet to Kashmir in around the 10th and 11th centuries. And when he returned from Kashmir, he brought back with him 32 artisans. And it is said that they constructed Alchi and another sort of, they attribute 108 monasteries sort of throughout the Western Himalayas to Rinchen Sangpo, out of which Alchi, Mangyu, and Sumdo are the three monasteries in Ladakh that they attribute to him. And the paintings, when you enter the Sumstek, you have these large, colossal figures of Avalokiteshvara, Manjushri, and Maitreya. They measure about 4 meters high. And they're all their dhotis, their lower garments are painted. And if we look closely, for instance, at the one of Avalokiteshvara, we see different scenes that are supposed to represent like a map of, they say, Srinagar, at that time. And whilst the rest of the buildings are all sort of religious structures, this one that I show here is said to be a palace, or maybe the home of a very high sort of lord or something. And we see them wearing, we see the king and the queen sort of sitting on the top wearing shawls. We see the use of turbans. But what we also see is the use of this tie-dye circle in the parasol that is in the upper left corner, in the robe that this musician blowing the long horn is wearing. And so we see also the ceiling of the monastery of Alchi. And there are all these panels on the ceiling which are painted and they look like textiles. And maybe this follows on from the Ladakhi tradition of having of covering your roof with a fabric so that the dirt and the mud doesn't fall in when you're sitting below. But we see many different kinds of textile types in the ceiling. We see lampas, we see cotton, we see printed fabrics, and we think that these are probably textiles that were seen by the artisans, or they were coming through Ladakh at this time. And it's very interesting because the thigma, which is a tie-dyed circle, is a textile tradition that we can actually now sort of kind of chart over more than 10 centuries. Of robes that were worn at the end of the 19th century, 20th century. They're written about in books. There's an Italian visitor to Ladakh called Daniele who writes and says that the thigma robe is no longer the fashion in Leh, and you can only find it in very remote parts of Ladakh. But we see now that thigma was used on robes, it was used on saddle covers, and it is a design or pattern that is made even today on belts, on robes. So it almost has this sort of continuous trajectory. It's made today, it's made using synthetic as well as natural dyes, but it's a design element that has persisted. Some people say that the circles that are made represent a dog's paw. Some say, no, it's flowers. Some say, no, it's mirrors. And it's sort of like to ward off sort of evil, that people wear this. We also see that weaving was sacred in Ladakh. Weaving was also connected to one of Buddha's disciples, one of the Mahasiddhas, one of the 84 Mahasiddhas. One of them was called Tantipa, which is the weaver. And here we see two different images of Tantipa. One is a wall painting from Saspol from the 14th century, and the other is on a thanka, an applique patchwork thanka from Likir, which is a little later. But we see that he's working on a foot loom. He's got a shuttle in his hand and he's weaving very much white woolen fabric, the nambu, that is still done today. And so, we understand that weaving is sacred in these parts of the world. It is connected. It comes a lot in sort of discourses, mainly in Buddhist discourses, not in Islamic ones, but it is still a very important part of their sort of religious life. We gradually come to accounts of textile in the region from visitors, British officials, explorers, tourists, and missionaries. And one of the first known accounts of textiles in this area come from two Jesuit priests who passed through on their way to Tibet in 1631. They had an audience with the king Sengi Namgyal, the same king who built Leh Palace and moved his capital from She to Leh. And they describe the king and queen wearing maroon-colored woolen robes. They also say that they were gifted, received many gifts from the king, and two of these, one was yak tails, and one was woolen fabric, and also some silk fabric that the king gifted to them. 200 years later, we had the British officers William Moorcroft and George Trebeck, who lived in Ladakh for over 2 years. They were trying to get permission to go to Yarkand, which they never got. And so they went to Yarkand in disguise, but they were murdered en route. But they left us very lengthy journals telling us, about sort of many parts of Ladakhi life and culture, but and also on trade, also the weaving that was done there. Moorcroft says that among some of the trade items that were textiles that he saw in the region was European broadcloth, Russian velvet, Chinese satin and brocade, ornamented leather boots from Lhasa, cotton stockings from Kashmir, and felt from Yarkand. So we have these kind of representations of this sort of wide sort of variety of textiles that were used in Ladakh and also that came in through trade from there. 20 years later, we had the British artist William Simpson, who was a contemporary of the Danielis, but not as famous as the Danielis, who were at the same time, who were in India at the same time as him. But Simpson sort of went a different path. He went towards Kashmir, and he also came towards Ladakh. And he painted a couple of images that show us the kind of textiles, garments that were worn there. If you see the image on the left, which shows you Leh Palace in the background, the horseman is probably a trader with his wife. And we know that because he has livestock with him, and they've got saddlebags tied on their backs. They look like goats. And so they have saddlebags on their backs. And the women in both the paintings, if you see, are wearing dresses where the skirt of the dress is made from different colored narrow strips of fabric, which would be yellow, red, blue, and green that have been stitched together. And we find those in Ladakh also. I mean, not made today, but you can find older pieces from the early sort of late 20th century, early 19th century. Then when we come further down, we have other images that tell us about textile traditions in the region. We have a doctor called Ahmed Shah, who was posted in Ladakh in 1906. And he made a collection of drawings and sketches that showed the life of the people in the region. And, they showed agricultural practices, the dress and jewelry that they wore, marriage ceremonies, funerary rituals, monastic life. And here, the images that he's drawn show a man twisting yarn, somebody working on a backstrap loom, somebody stitching, a woman spinning, and somebody working on a foot loom. We have other images from the British Library. Arnold Pike again shows women carding and spinning yarn. And then the Moravian missionaries also, they were great. Apart from spreading the gospel, they were also very interested in the history of the place, the language of the place. And so they wrote extensively about different parts of Ladakh and also different traditions. And this is a marriage scene. Franca was probably one of the most prolific writers, Moravian missionary writers from Ladakh. And he also illustrated a lot of his manuscripts. So we got a good idea of what also, how people looked and wore and what was used there. We have other artists that came through. There were a couple of women artists also, like Lene Schneider or Leah Lefugi. Leah is from France. Lene was German. These women came. Lene especially has done a whole range of textiles. Sort of a whole range of watercolors. I think maybe she was sitting around in Le Bazaar and she was drawing the people that she saw, the men and the women wearing their peraks, having their little baskets on their back, wearing goatskin capes. Again, giving us a very good indication of the kind of clothes that were worn there. Leah actually went after Nubra And this is a reincarnation of Sultan Nima, who's one of the high Rinpoches responsible for building Samsung Monastery in Sumur. And again, she shows him here wearing, a sort of Ladakhi style concha rather than monastic robes. It's very interesting that, we have so many of these images and paintings from this period, sort of before the 1940s, to give us a very good indication of what was worn and used in Ladakh. Photography actually came quite early to the region. It came in the late 19th century. And so we have this sort of archival images, again, to show us, how people dressed, how people, what they used. The image on the left is of Ghulam Rasul Galwan and his mother and his two daughters. Galwan was one of the first Ladakhis to actually, he was a porter, and he started off life very poor. But as he did more and more sort of helping out with visitors when they would come to Ladakh, he sort of became quite well known as a guide. And one of the families that he actually guided were a husband and wife from America called Mr. and Mrs. Barrett. And Mrs. Barrett encouraged Galwan to write his life story. And he did that in very broken English, which he didn't edit much, so that was really good. And he tells us about how when he was young, he didn't have proper clothes to wear, he didn't have shoes to wear. But then as he continued to work for various people who came into this area to either explore or to go on, pilgrimage or whatever, we can see that he grew in prosperity. We also see that the women here are not wearing the perak, and this is sort of early 20th century. So the Muslim women had already stopped wearing the perak, and they had replaced it with what was called a jugni, which they also wore in the center of their forehead. But now they wore it with a sort of a white cloth rather than the perak. So these distinctions were already beginning to sort of come between Buddhist and Muslim communities. But it's also interesting to see that today, some Muslim women will now again wear the perak at their wedding. Then we have Colonel Schomburg, who was probably staying at his guest house. And we have a lot of these images that are more ethnographic in style. Maybe the photographer asked them to dress up. Maybe he asked them to pose, to do certain things. But they are also an indication of, again, of dress. So you can see the women are wearing like I mentioned earlier, they were not allowed to use imported fabric. They could only use a little bit on the edge. So they have it on the edge of their robes, on the slits of their robes. They're wearing woolen robes. So photography, again, tells us, quite a lot about what was used and worn in Ladakh. Then it's very interesting. We have a very interesting collection of dolls that have come out of this region. I'm not exactly sure how doll making actually came into Ladakh, but these are two of the oldest dolls that I found in full neck in the Moravian Mission Museum over there, which is near Leeds. And then the same Mrs. Barrett, who encouraged Galwan to write a book, also got a set of 5 dolls made specially for her, which are now at the Harvard Peabody Museum. And she did them as a Muslim man and woman, a Buddhist man and woman, and a monk, to show dress, to show the fabric that was in the region. And doll making continues today as a tradition. Phuntsukang still makes dolls in Leh, and so do a couple of other doll makers, mainly now for tourists, but using local fabric, using the same local styles of dress. Trade was very important also to textiles that are used and found in Ladakh. And the most important fiber that was traded from Western Tibet to Ladakh and then on to Kashmir was pashmina. The Kashmir shawl is already quite well known and quite well documented. But the trade was actually the rules of the trade were actually set in after the Treaty of Tingmuskang in the 17th century, where it was said that only Ladakhis could go to Western Tibet to trade. There were a group of palace traders, out of which Baba Siddiq, shown here, was also one of them. So there were 9 palace traders, and these palace traders would go to Western Tibet. They would bring the pashmina as far as Leh to a place called Spituk. And then you had these Tibet bakals that would come up from Kashmir, and then they would buy the pashmina from the palace traders and take it back down to Srinagar, where it was woven. You also had the 2 missions that were set up after the Treaty of Tinmusgang, which was the Lobchak mission that went from Leh to Lhasa, and the Chaba, which went from Lhasa to Leh. So the Chaba was mainly to bring brick tea to Ladakh. And the Lobchak mission was not tribute to the Dalai Lama, but it was more like a trade mission to Ladakh. And when they would return, they would bring silk fabric with them. They would bring pashmina with them. They would bring a lot of fabric also that was from China. And then just to show you some images of the trade that came down through Kashmir, it was 3 days. It took 3 weeks on horse and pony to bring the fiber back to Ladakh. And then just to digress a little bit and show you the woven shawls that were made in Kashmir using the kani weave, which was like of weaving, or they were embroidered. And pashmina shawls, again, Ranjit Singh was a Dogra ruler, and they were very, very sort of very important to him and to his court. And I mean, the history of pashmina shawl is a totally different lecture, and for another time. Other fabrics that came in through trade from Central Asia, from what is today Xinjiang, what was then, Yarkhan, Khotan, and Kashgar. You had silk that came in. It was largely silk yarn that would come in. It would go through Ladakh and down to Banaras, to Varanasi, where it was often woven, and then it would come back up to Ladakh and go back to Xinjiang. Some of the fabric was also kept in Ladakh and sold there. So it was used for women's blouses. It was used for sashes and belts. And these are some of the traders in Yarkhan. It was probably one of the most treacherous journeys, crossing the Despang Plain. It was said to be littered with the bones of animals and humans. It was a very, very treacherous journey. And the only animals that could go do this was the double-humped Bactrian camel, because they could actually hold the water for the whole journey. Yarkhan was also known for its woven carpets, sort of knotted carpets with natural colors. These are some carpets that were made for the mosque in Leh. They were a special commission by the Khoja brothers, who commissioned 4 carpets to be made for the Jama Masjid in Leh. Unfortunately, along the way, one horse carrying one of the carpets fell and slipped in the river, but 3 carpets made it to Leh. They are only opened during the month of Ramzan in the Jama Masjid, and we can see that each janamaz setting is different. Right across the carpet, one carpet seats about, I think that's almost about 64 people can pray on one carpet. And then we find many carpets also offered by Muslims who have returned from Hajj in the mosque. This is the mosque in Sheh. You have printed prayer carpets on the top, and then as you go through the layers in the mosque, you'll find woven ones, you'll find felt. So we do see a lot of, these used to also come from Xinjiang. Also from Central Asia, mainly from Uzbekistan, we have ikat silk. It was used in the monasteries. It was used to make women's robes. Sometimes the women who didn't want to, especially in Kargil area, we find women who used to wear full robes made from this silk ikat. And we find it around as offerings in Buddhist monasteries to the statues. So this was another fabric that came through. And then we had silk brocade, which was called gyasar, which used to come through China and into Tibet and then into Ladakh. And it was mainly in a very sort of set and defined color palette. It was green, yellow, blue, white, and red. And you will find that It was often woven with gold and silver threads. It was always woven in a narrow width. It was a very thick kind of silk. Most of the patterns woven into the fabric had some kind of relationship to Buddhism, either the 8 auspicious signs, or they had flowers like chrysanthemums or lilies or whatever. And you would find monasteries. It was almost like monasteries would be adorned with these sort of fabrics, not only on the statues, not only on the borders for tankas, but also as pillar covers, also as ceiling covers and all that. And maybe in many ways, in a land where very few flowers grew, because it was, we're talking about altitudes of over 10,000 feet. Maybe this was one way of offering flowers to the gods, of bringing in that kind of offering, but through fabric. We also see robes, again, that largely came from China, and that were the dragon robes that were worn by the royal family at times of weddings, by the singers, that accompanied the bride as she was making her way from her home to the palace. So we do find, many of these sort of robes that talk about the dragons and the power of the dragons, or that the people who wear them. And then you have Mount Meru and the waters and all sort of woven into the body of the robe. Some of these were woven, some of these were embroidered. Again, even in Ladakh, we see wall paintings, also with people, wearing robes that were probably silk. We see the same kind of Chinese symbols of long life and prosperity. We see it on robes, again, in the royal collection of the royal family. So we have a good indication that there was quite a big trade in this sort of silk fabric that was coming through China into Tibet, and then coming into Ladakh. But what was interesting is that a lot of this silk fabric was made in China, but sometime towards probably the end of the 19th century in Tibet, they began to find some of these Chinese fabrics very expensive. They found that gold was getting more expensive. And so they asked weavers in Benares, who were also making golden fabric with gold and silver threads, is that, can you make this fabric for us? And so you saw this whole sort of shift from Gyasser fabric being woven in China. Suddenly, the weavers in Benares started weaving it, and they started supplying, to Tibet, to monasteries in Ladakh, and this is a tradition that very much goes on today. But whilst a lot of the Buddhist population was wearing gyasir, and because gyasir had, sort of the Buddhist symbols in it, we find that the Muslim population wore a silk brocade called kinship. Again, kinship was made in Benares. It was coming up through trade. It also had gold and silver thread, but it did not have the Buddhist symbols. And so we find that whilst the Buddhist populations of those who could afford it were wearing gyasir, their counterparts in Islam were wearing kinship. Brocade, again, was also used, but without the Buddhist symbols, by the Muslims in Ladakh. For instance, here, to mark the death of Ali, the Prophet's son-in-law, on the occasion of Asad, a procession of coffins are covered in silk brocade and carried through places where Muslims are also largely living. We also see alams, which were sacred flags. These are carried in procession, again at the same time, and each alam, will show you the prophet. It'll show you his horse. These were made by women. They were largely embroidered. Today we find that more and more they're printed. They'll have the woman's name embroidered on them. They'll have the name of the village embroidered on them, and these are again taken out in procession on the occasion of Asad, to mark the death of Ali. Again, some images of kinship fabric that came up through Benares. Also in a collection of Chimde Monastery, a monk's hat, a belt that is said to have belonged to one of the queens, and then she offered it to the monastery. Yeah. And then other sort of textile traditions, textile types that we see in Ladakh. We see silk belts that came from Assam, embroidered thangas from China, a lot of printed fabric that was used to back thangas, and then also a lot of bric-a-brac like piping, buttons, even measuring tapes that, rulers that came in from America, measuring tapes, needles, buttons that came in from the Nizam of Hyderabad's sort of kingdom. So, anybody who says that, oh, Ladakh was remote, Ladakh was very cut off, I think it's a bit of a fallacy, because Ladakh was really a place where a lot of trade was coming through. There were a lot of items, different items that you can see here. And this is just one part of it. I mean, I'm just talking about textiles. I mean, if you came into jewelry or you came into other items, you would see other things that were also traded. So Ladakh was by far never really a remote region. I'll just quickly touch on the Moravian missionaries, who were a sort of a denomination from what was then the Czech Republic, and who came to India in sort of the late sort of 19th century. They actually wanted to go to Tibet. They were very keen on learning Tibetan Buddhism, but they never made it there because Tibet didn't allow outsiders to come in. And so they bifurcated. Some of them went to Lahaul Spiti, and some of them came to Ladakh. And one of the interesting things about the Moravians is that they believed in the spiritual value of productive work. So whilst they were also preaching the gospel, they were also they also tried to be economically self-sufficient. They were also artisans. They were craftspeople. They did handicrafts. They did textiles. They did leather work. They were interested in architecture, in farming. And so they brought all these attributes with them to regions like Ladakh or Keelong or Phu, where they settled. One of the things they did in Ladakh is they started a sewing and knitting school. They introduced knitting in Ladakh. They taught women to make socks and hats and gloves and scarves. And these were things that they would sell, and they would make an additional income. One of the other things that they did was they started an industrial school for sort of for the handicrafts, mainly for weaving. The gentleman you see in the upper corner wearing the solar topi is Walter Ashbo. And Walter Ashbo came to Ladakh in 1939, and he started setting up this industrial school. He got some funds from the government in Kashmir. He got the tall gentleman you see standing next to him is Pandit Kashinath. He brought Pandit Kashinath to Ladakh, and he started to introduce the charkha for spinning. That's the spinning wheel you see the women in the upper photograph working on. He also introduced a wider footloom, still a footloom, but much a one that could weave a much wider fabric. And he brought women in to work on that, to train on that. Earlier in my presentation, I said that women were not allowed to work on the footloom. And I asked people in Ladakh who were, whom I'd met years ago and who remembered Walter Ashbo. And I said, how did people allow women to work on the footloom when there was, these bans, these sort of prohibitions? And they said, well, he did a bold step, and, inlay people are more educated. And so, we let it go. But it is from this that Walter Ashbo has today, I mean, his legacy, if anything, is that women today work on the footloom in Ladakh. They find that now less and less men are interested in working as weavers because they have gone on to join other occupations like tourism or the army or government jobs. And they were finding that less and less men were weaving. And so they began to weave on the footloom, both the wider loom as well as the very traditional Ladakhi loom, as you can see Sheangmo working. They tend not to be itinerant. They tend to stay at their homes, and people bring in their fiber, spun yarn, and they use it for weaving. So this is the kind of the impact that the missionaries made in Ladakh. Walter Ashbo also introduced carpet weaving on a frame loom in Ladakh. He found one gentleman called Sonam Paljor in the village of Khalse, who had learned how to weave on a frame loom, and from Tibetans who were passing through, and he invited him to the industrial school, and Sonam Paljor started, to weave on a frame loom. Otherwise, earlier, all carpets, sort of floor coverings in Ladakh, were woven on backstrap looms in 3 pieces and then stitched up together. So these were some of the sort of impacts and changes the Moravian missionaries brought to Ladakh that continue today. And today we find that after Walter Ashbur left in 1947, he handed most of his looms and equipment over to the Indian government. And this led to the first handicraft training centers set up in Ladakh today. And today we see that the handicraft training centers are still there. Some of the women who trained at them have now gone on and set up their own weaving workshops. And so weaving, from becoming a predominantly male craft in these regions, has now, sort of spread amongst women. And it's a craft that continues very much in Ladakh today. It's the same with dyeing. Dyeing, again, was a craft that was only done by men. But now more and more women are dyeing it, are coming out as dyers. And there's been a big revival also in Ladakh towards natural dyes, whereas synthetic dyes started coming in the 1940s. And so then more and more people were dyeing their fabric. Now they're trying to sort of revive their natural dyes that used to be there in the past. Another thing we find in Ladakh is that since 2010, we have many fashion designers that have suddenly started coming in, Ladakhis who have gone outside to study at institutes like National Institute of Fashion Technology or National Institute of Design, and they're coming back and they're sort of creating this sort of identity, a new identity almost for Ladakhi dress and fashion. They're looking at the old forms, at the old designs, but they're saying, how can we change parts of the vocabulary? How can we make this something that every bride or every bridegroom wants to wear? And Jigmit Kotier is probably one of the first designers who came back, him and his wife. They set up their company. They also go into different parts of Ladakh and study regional dress. And then every year they sort of do a new collection. They've shown at Fashion Weeks a couple of times in India. And it's Jigmit Kotier has sort of gone on today to become one of the sort of most sought after fashion designers, if they can afford it, for young brides to wear, to say that I'm wearing Jigmit Kotier. It's become a very sort of fashionable statement to make. There are other designers that have come up, for instance, Namza, that focuses a lot on the silk route and sort of what was worn by the kings, sort of the queens and that generation. And she works a lot with silk and making robes. I think she's also shown here once at the London Fashion Week. Then we have another young designer, Stanzin Palmo, who does more digital work, but she takes Ladakhi designs like the apricot blossoms that you see here, or the Hopi bird or whatever, and prints them on the fabric, but again, makes the same kind of style of robes that men and women wear. We see also a movement towards kind of your more slow, sustainable fashion, people working with pashmina in natural colors. There's an organization called Lena that works only with natural dyes, making pashmina scarves, blankets, shawls. So we see this kind of almost like a sort of revival in Ladakhi dress taking place in Ladakh. There's a lot of young people who are identifying again with dress, where there had been a little lull sort of earlier on. It's almost like it is sort of, come back again today. But at the same time, we see a lot of secondhand clothes being sold in lay market. You will have some shops that will sell traditional dress, fabric that has been, coming through the region for years. But on the other hand, we also see a lot of containers coming with secondhand clothing from places, for instance, like South Korea, and they sell in the market. There's a whole street for a secondhand market that comes up on a Sunday in Leh Bazaar, and people will say, well, I'd rather buy a jacket for 200 rupees than, spend 2,000 rupees on getting a woolen robe. So there are sort of the economics also involved in this. We also see that Ladakh has also inspired new kind of clothing coming up. For instance, high altitude clothing. We have the Indian Army in Ladakh. We have a big presence, especially guarding the Siachen Glacier, which is very cold. Its temperatures go down to -20, -30. So, a lot of clothing has also been developed, not in Ladakh, outside the Ladakh, but for the soldiers who guard the borders in this region, which has also inspired exhibitions. This was by a contemporary artist called Baptiste Coelho, who has done a whole exhibition based around clothing and fabric and textiles that is only used by the Indian Army, and it was called Thread by Thread. We have had textile art residencies in Ladakh, again inspired by this idea of building bridges, and this idea of building communities together, people from across the sort of borders together. We've also had a young Ladakhi girl from Kargil who's been looking at this idea of weaving as the home or as the kitchen as being a very much a patriarchal arena, but what is it that we can bring into these spaces that is also feminine and female? I mean, we think of Ladakh as a matriarchal society, but in fact, it's not. It's very much a patriarchal society, and very much one where women have to sort of assert themselves, to make themselves heard, and Zahira has been trying to do that through the artwork that she creates. Earlier this year, in April, the government actually passed an order saying that all Ladakhis, especially those who are in government jobs, had to wear their local dress to work on a Monday. And this is just to show you some scenes from that. And again, it was a very much I mean, I push to say that we have to preserve our culture. Our culture is dying. And so one way of preserving it is by asserting and making it mandatory that you have to wear local dress. At the same time, there's a lot of sort of transformations taking place in Ladakh. There are many people who have come up from other parts of India who have settled here, who have also sort of been part of the sort of textile traditions here. And now the Ladakhis are beginning maybe to feel a bit threatened. They're beginning to, and it's not only in textiles, you find it happening in restaurants, in hotels, and guest houses. People are coming from other parts of India, the Delhi, Bihar, Gujarat, and all, and setting up places here. So again, in April this year, the Late Tailoring Cooperative in Leh put a ban on non-locals stitching traditional Ladakhi attire. So it's a very difficult time for Ladakhis for also to understand what is happening in Ladakh. At this one time, you're banning non-local tailors, but you allow dyeing to continue. And maybe that's because dyeing was also associated with lower caste people. So it's okay if outsiders still dye, but you don't want them to tailor, or you don't want them to weave. So there's a lot of transformations taking place at very many different levels. And it's very interesting to understand, or to just watch and see what will happen in the years to come. And I just wanted to end by kind of like saying that, for the next generation, will they recognize the stories and the meanings associated with their textiles? I mean, they are sort of storehouses of information. They talk about history, they talk about trade, they talk about sort of the stories from this region. They talk about transformations. And, this craft holds so much meaning. How much will be remembered, how much will be forgotten, and how much of it will they engage with? Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was a really incredible talk. I really, really enjoyed that. And thank you very much. Well, we've got a lot of participants. So I'm gonna head straight to the chat and see if or what has been written, because we've got lots of messages already. So thank you so much for such an excellent talk. This is Megna's question. I'm curious about the use of cotton in the traditional dress worn by Ladakhis. I understand that in the 1800s, cotton from Turkestan passed through Ladakh and there were accounts of Yarkandi cotton cloth being used by Ladakhis. Was cotton used in men and women's clothing, in Ladakh at any point, as innerwear inside the guncha, or was it stitched on the cuffs or the collars? Like you said, was common with imported material. The tigma pattern that you showed, would it also be made with wool or cotton?
Yeah. So, hi, Meghna. Just to answer your question. So thigma was always made on wool, at least in Ladakh. It was never made on cotton. And yes, cotton did come to Ladakh. It not only from Turkestan, it also came from parts of India. From Gujarat, you find printed cotton. You find plain cotton fabric that they used to wear and make pants out of largely. Almost like what we call in India a churidar. I've seen cotton churidars that were made, and people would wear them under their pants. For those of you who don't know, it's like a pant with a lot of pleats almost that come from your ankles to your knees. It kind of bunches up. And it was used, and printed cotton was also used on the sort of cuffs of clothes, on the collars, on the slits of people's dresses. So yes, there was cotton definitely came into Ladakh.
Okay, so we have another question.
Yeah.
What an interesting presentation. Maybe you said, but I missed it. What are the kinds of black ears made of?
So you mean the sort of black ears that the women who are wearing the perak?
Yeah.
So those are made from goat skin, generally from the smaller goats, the kids. They're made from goats. It's said that initially the perak did not have ears, but one of the Ladakhi queens, I don't know in which century, they said she had an earache, and in order to keep her ears warm, she used these goat skin ears, and that's how they have stayed since then, but I'm not sure when. Also, for those of you interested, I mean, the perak is actually, the goat skin ears are actually braided into the woman's hair. And it's only that big turquoise strip that sits in the middle. So every night when a woman would go to sleep, she would only take off the turquoise bit, and the ears would actually remain, and she would sleep with that. And there were actually professional hair washers, mainly in Leh, and also in some of the villages where women wore this. And once a month, the women would unbraid the ears from their hair, wash their hair, and then these women would braid them back in. Yeah.
That's similar to in Lhasa.
Yeah, with the big headdresses. Yeah.
Okay. This keeps moving around. I was late to so
No,
this is from Mandy, the types of dyes that we used.
I mean, people use dyes maybe from things like wild rose, walnut, soot, pomegranate, not so much. No. Madder. Yeah. Indigo came up through trade. Yeah, these were the kind of dyes that were used there.
Okay.
Embroidery. Embroidery was not widely done in Ladakh. We find some embroidery around Kargil and some of the areas around Kargil. Again, largely embroidery done with wool and sort of sort of like thick work, not very fine work. But you do find embroidered shawls that used to come up from Kashmir, either embroidered or woven, and they would be transformed by women in Ladakh to make their capes mainly that they would wear.
And did anyone knit?
Knit, yeah, I talked about knitting in my presentation. No?
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, the Moravian missionaries and knitting.
Right. Are there any human bone textile tools? In Iron Age Scotland, we have evidence of human bone spindles, spindle whorls.
Yeah.
Made from femur heads.
No.
And smoothers from femurs.
Yeah.
Anything like that in duck.
I haven't come across any, but I don't really know of anything being made from human bone.
Okay. So that's the please could you give more details about your books and further reading, either in the chat or afterwards by email? that's from Melanie Davis.
Oh, okay.
Your-
Yes, you can put my email in.
Yeah, so Monisha's books are also listed on the website page for this event. They include co-editing Ladakh Culture at the Crossroads and Pashmina, the Kashmir Shawl and Beyond, and also the book based on your PhD, which is weaving among the living fabric, weaving among the nomads of the Ladakh Himalayas. So they're all published.
And a lot of other articles also that you can find online.
So
why did weaving become obsolete in the Kargil region? So one of the things that's happened in Kargil is that people are keeping less livestock. So where they usually used to keep a lot more livestock, sheep, goats, and then they would use their fiber for weaving. What they find now is that for one, the border is, because Kargil is very, very near to the border. Large parts of Kargil are very near the border. So the border is, they're not allowed to take their animals there to graze. It's also mined. It's also highly militarized. So I think they found that they were keeping less and less livestock. They didn't have enough also fiber for weaving. And also I think people were less and less interested in weaving. So for instance, even 20 years ago, when I did go into Kargil, I couldn't find a weaver in Kargil. So then I was sent to some surrounding villages. I managed to find a weaver, but he himself had also not woven for the last 12 years. Also, we find in Kargil, people aren't wearing Ladakhi dress as much, though maybe now again there's been a revival. They were sort of more shifting towards more Western dress or sort of Indian, shalwar, kurta kind of thing. Kargil is also in an interesting location. It's sort of between Ladakh and Kashmir. So it gets influenced by both regions in many ways also in dress and textiles. Do people create textiles for tourists? Yes, they do. They do create a lot of textiles for tourists, yeah.
Which includes the dolls, right?
The dolls, the bags, blankets. Even the nomadic communities now make some, like floor coverings or blankets and all that, and in the hope of being able to sell it to tourists that pass through.
Does the Jigmat culture, does that have a shop?
Yes.
Yeah, it does.
Yeah, they have a lot of all the designers I showed, they all have shops in Leh Bazaar. Yeah.
But Jigmat culture also has a museum, right?
Yes, he has a museum, but it's by appointment only.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
So we've gone quiet now for questions. So while we give people just a little minute to have a last think if they have any questions, I wrote down one or two. And I'm not sure if you already said, but I wondered if you know when Varanasi starts to supply Ladakh and Tibet with the brocade fabric.
It's towards the sort of late 1800s.
Okay.
It's
19th century.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. It's documented. I have I've written quite a bit on that.
In the Crossroads of Culture you've written about.
No, I've done separate since then more research on that, and it can actually be traced. So what used to happen is that Kalimpong was a big trading center, and a lot of traders would meet in Kalimpong, whether they were coming from Tibet or China or Nepal, and also from Varanasi. So it was in Kalimpong where the Tibetan traders knew that that in Varanasi they were making kinship. And they said, if you can make kinship, you can also make gyasir. So they gave samples of gyasir to these traders, who then took it back to Varanasi and they started copying that. And also, there are various stories. Some also say that there were some Tibetan traders who had gone to Sarnath, because a lot of Tibetans went on pilgrimage there. So they were saying that maybe they took some of these samples over to the weavers in Benares. But Benares weavers are so apt at making, they're so good at this, very skilled weavers. And then slowly they started making, and there are two brothers called the Qasim brothers, who are sort of said to be the first two brothers who started this whole weaving gyasir, and then it gradually spread in the communities. But then what happened in 1959 is a lot of the weavers in Benares thought this is the end. Now Tibet is finished. We will know, nobody will, because the biggest demand for the fabric was from Tibet. Bhutan, Sikkim, Ladakh had much smaller quantities that they ordered. And they thought that this is finished and it will not, it will not revive. And so a lot of them switched over to sari weaving, for instance, and they didn't keep their looms. They sort of worked their looms in order to weave saris. The Kasims were the only family who kept their looms.
Okay.
And they said, no, the Tibetans will settle. And when they settle, they will regroup, they will rebuild monasteries, and they will
Need it
again. Yeah. Yeah.
It's amazing.
So the Dalai Lama, not recently, but many years ago, when he met the Kasim brothers, he said, these are the people who weave the fabric of our religion. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Right. Then
Impressed.
I think that's quite a nice place to leave it.
Yes, I think so too. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Monisha ji. That was a wonderful lecture and a really, really lovely way to close this series. Thank you everyone for coming today, and thank you for attending the talks across the year. It's been really wonderful. Thank you.